Welcome to Nice and Blunt. I'm Adam Riancho, and these are my quarterback, tight end, and defensive rankings for Week 6. We're going to start at the quarterback position, where there's only two teams on bye, the Vikings and the Texans, and odds are you weren't really confident enough at this point to start Wentz or CJ Stroud. They had some good games recently, but still not that big of a deal to not have them available in Week 6. Let us get into the matchups at the position. This graph shows you every single matchup against quarterbacks, giving up the most points on the left and then the fewest on the right. Those stats are in blue. But in red this week, I'm going to show you how many of those points specifically come on the ground, how many of them are attributed to rushing stats, whether it's rushing yards or rushing touchdowns. Where are the best matchups for opposing quarterbacks that run the ball? The best matchup so far, the one giving up the most points on the ground, would be the Chargers, who allow 41 rushing yards per game. That is the most in the NFL, and 4 quarterback touchdowns on the ground. So this week against Tua, it kind of feels irrelevant. Tua definitely doesn't move the needle in that regard, and maybe the Chargers defense really shuts him down if he doesn't give you anything on the ground. I'm not sure Tua is the best play this week. But number 2 in that stat would be the second best matchup on the year, and that would be the same game, the Dolphins, who give up 8.1 points. That's 33 rushing yards per game and 4 rushing touchdowns this season. Herbert does run the ball. He had over 50 rushing yards last week against the Commanders. I think Herbert will keep the floor high thanks to roughly 8 fantasy points on the ground. So like Herbert this week, I think even with the run game banged up and the offensive line depleted, he should have a good game. On paper, at least, it is a good matchup. And then the next best spot on the ground would be Kansas City, and that's pretty irrelevant against Jared Goff. They allow 36 rushing yards per game, but Goff giving you 5 is pretty rare, so I don't think that really helps Jared Goff. Against the pass, they've been pretty good. In Buffalo, they're also pretty vulnerable to running quarterbacks, but Michael Penix doesn't really run it that much. So overall, the best spots on the ground are kind of not really helpful in fantasy. Another good one would be Pittsburgh. They get Dillon Gabriel this week, and he only ran for 5 yards against the Vikings last week, so not expecting him to contribute. And then Dallas also gives up a lot of yards, 30 rushing yards per game, 2 rushing touchdowns to quarterbacks this season. Bryce Young might be decent, but last week I predicted a rushing touchdown for him and he did nothing on the ground, so maybe that part of his game is gone. It has been leaving him a little bit this season. And then Jacksonville also kind of vulnerable on the ground to quarterbacks. Darnold rarely scrambles though, so kind of not a big deal. And then Tampa Bay also high on this list, but against Mac Jones, who the fuck cares? And then lastly, the only one giving up more than 4 points per game on average on the ground to quarterbacks would be New Orleans, so maybe Drake Maye does contribute on the ground. Last week, he did not. I also predicted a rushing touchdown for Maye. That did not hit last week, so maybe he'll be good. They give up 29 yards per game on average. And then there are 4 other teams that I want to mention that do give up decent yardage on the ground. The Commanders give up 27 rushing yards per game. That does rank top 10 against the position, so Caleb should be pretty good on the ground. The Jets also give up 27 rushing yards, so Bo Nix might scramble a bit. And then Stafford never runs the ball against Baltimore. It's a decent spot. And then lastly, Atlanta also give up 23 rushing yards per game, so Josh Allen should be running pretty well. But let's just look at overall who are the best matchups and who are the worst. The best remains the same. It's been Dallas all year, so Bryce Young gets an upgrade. But last week we upgraded him. He had a top 2 matchup against the Dolphins, and he did not show up. Bryce Young, I don't think, is safe enough to trust. Justin Herbert has been pretty mediocre since week 1, but he gets the second best matchup against the Dolphins, so I do give him an upgrade in the ranks this week. And then Baltimore has been terrible against the position, so they give up a lot of passing yards, passing touchdowns. They gave up 4 to CJ Stroud last week. Stafford should be phenomenal against the Ravens this week. The Steelers have, on paper, been a good matchup for opposing quarterbacks, but Dillon Gabriel probably doesn't crack your lineup or even come off the waiver wire. Tampa Bay has been vulnerable as well. They let Sam Darnold torch them last week, so Mac Jones should be productive, assuming he gets the start. Tampa Bay gives up over 20 points per game, and so do the Jets. Bo Nix should have a good game against the Jets, assuming the London travel doesn't lead to some weird shit in the UK. The Saints, also an upgrade for Drake Maye. They rank top 7 on this graph. And then the Bengals also give up a lot of points. Jordan Love should have a good game. And then the last two that allow over 18 points per game would be Washington and Chicago. That Bears-Commanders game, I think, has shootout potential. So all of those quarterbacks I just mentioned getting an upgrade in the ranks this week. But then on the opposite side of this chart, there are some big downgrades, and two of the worst 3 matchups are on bye. So Houston allowing only 9.4 points per game. Thankfully, we don't have to worry about them. They are on bye this week. And then same goes for Minnesota, that does rank bottom 3 on this list. So 12.9 points, who cares? The Vikings are on bye. And that means Josh Allen gets the biggest downgrade of any quarterback in terms of matchups this week. The Falcons have been really good on defense, pretty underrated from a fantasy standpoint. Across the board, pretty much every position kind of struggles against the Falcons. So Allen, you're still going to start, but maybe is not the QB1 this week. And then fourth on this list, another downgrade would be Denver. We all know the Broncos are a tough spot. So Justin Fields going to have a hard time passing the ball this week. Maybe the rushing stats pad the numbers, however. And then bottom 5 would be Arizona. Bottom 6 is Indianapolis. So Kyler Murray and Daniel Jones are both on the bottom end of this chart. Definitely some downgrades for them. Their defenses have been pretty decent. And then Carolina's defense has limited quarterbacks to less than 15 points per game, but Dak is playing at an MVP level. I think you're probably still going to trust Dak. And then Geno Smith also gets a downgrade. The Titans have been kind of vulnerable. They're so bad against the run that quarterbacks aren't really exploiting that defensive matchup. So Geno Smith, definitely not a safe play in your lineup at all. So that's it for the matchups I wanted to bring up. Now let's pivot to all of the rankings. We're at number 1. I know I mentioned the Falcons are a tough spot, but I'm still going to start Josh Allen. I'm still going to rank him at number 1. He's been too good this season. He's the quarterback 1 in fantasy. So let's keep him in the must-start tier. Let's not get cute. But I do want to acknowledge this is the worst matchup you can find this week. Less than 13 points per game allowed by the Falcons on average. But you would expect against Josh Allen, that number is going to significantly increase over the weekend, and odds are the Falcons don't rank bottom 2 next week on the list. So they give up 23 rushing yards per game. I think he'll contribute on the ground, but I could also envision Bijan and Algier dominate time of possession, and I could envision less than 3 touchdowns for Josh Allen. That's possibly one of his worst games of the season. Still going to start him though. Can't bench him. At number 1, he remains in the elite tier. At number 2 though, we're dropping down a tier, but I genuinely think Mahomes could make an argument to be put above the purple line. Make no mistake, Mahomes has been very good in fantasy this season. He's been mediocre the last couple years, but with his rushing contributions, he has been fantastic. And I think against Detroit, even if he loses the game, it's going to be a very good offensive output from the Chiefs. This game is kind of a must-win. The Chiefs cannot afford to fall to 2-4. And last week, Jake Browning threw 3 touchdowns against Detroit. It did come in garbage time, but still their secondary is pretty vulnerable. Mahomes is the quarterback 3 in fantasy, averaging 23.1 points per game. That's only half a point behind Josh Allen on average. So I trust Mahomes. He's been a very good fantasy play this season. I think against Detroit, he will show up. I would start him against the Lions in primetime. At number 3, I think Jayden Daniels returns to elite production in fantasy this week. He has been a bit mediocre. Last week, the Chargers matchup was kind of tough, but JCM scoring 2 touchdowns was mainly the reason why his upside was capped. He did still scramble a decent amount. And this week against Chicago, he gets a top 10 matchup. They are not expecting Terry to come back. He's yet to practice this week. So there was some optimism, but it's sounding less likely. I still think Deebo Samuel will contribute enough to pad the numbers for Daniels in the passing game. But rushing stats, I think, will be there. Chicago's defense does not scare you. They are coming off a bye, but if anything, I think that helps their offense. And I trust that at home, Jayden Daniels will keep this game very close. If they're not going to win by blowout, as they have at home this season, then I think it'll be like a 35-33 type of final score. I expect Daniels to play pretty well. So I think as he gets further along in his knee recovery, I think he'll be closer to the elite option we expected when we drafted him. If you have Daniels, this is the week where I think he's back in the top 5. Definitely start Jayden Daniels. I also told you to start Jalen Hurts last night, and he was averaging 21.3 points per game in his previous 4 matchups versus the Giants. And in the Blunt League, he did drop 21.9 last night. So pretty consistent with his averages. Maybe that's not top 5 at the position this week, but above 20 points, that's definitely enough to satisfy you as a player worth starting. To bench him would have been pretty strange. So even with some turnovers, Jalen Hurts still a pretty locked in top 10 play. At number 4, I think he did live up to close to the expectation. At number 5, I think we're dropping down a tier, but I would want to start all of these players. I was actually tempted to rank Stafford much higher. At number 5, I think he is a lock in the lineup this week. He should ball out against the Ravens. It's a top 3 matchup. They're giving up a shit ton of passing touchdowns. The last 2 weeks, they have allowed both quarterbacks they've faced to throw 4 touchdowns on them. CJ Stroud was having a rough season up until he faced Baltimore. So if we look at Stafford, he's on fire. He has 10 touchdowns and only 2 interceptions in his last 4 games. And he is making a case for MVP. He's playing at a very high rate, and the back injury is not a concern. Stafford is a live bet to throw 4 touchdowns in this matchup, especially off the somewhat embarrassing loss to the Niners. I think this is a get-right game. I think Stafford is a must-start. I was very tempted to rank him in the top 3, but without those rushing stats, it's hard to bump him over Jalen Hurts, Jayden Daniels, and Mahomes. But at number 5, definitely a must-start. I am 100% endorsing Stafford at Baltimore. Number 6, I got Caleb Williams at Washington, and we have seen Caleb offer some elite upside this season, especially thanks to his rushing production. And the Commanders do allow 27 rushing yards per game to the quarterback position. That is tied for 8th most in the NFL, so I would expect roughly 30 yards on the ground from Caleb, and that really pads the stats that offers a very safe floor. On the season, he does rank as quarterback 5 in fantasy points, but part of that is the matchup-dependent nature of his production. He absolutely torched Dallas, as most quarterbacks do, but the Commanders' defense have not been a downgrade. They actually rank top 10 this season against the position. They did limit Justin Herbert, but also gave up 60 rushing yards to Herbert. I think Caleb will move the ball pretty effectively. Off the bye, I trust Ben Johnson's game plan, especially in the first half. I think the Bears will come out swinging. So I like Caleb this week. I think he has a good game. I think he keeps it close with Daniels, and it's a high-scoring game. I am telling you to start Caleb Williams in week 6. At number 7, I'm going to keep starting Baker Mayfield versus San Francisco, but he loses another pass catcher. It looks like Chris Godwin is doubtful for this game, and Mike Evans is not ready to return. So a lot hinges on the back of Igbuka, who might drop 200 yards this week, but Baker's making a case for MVP. He has been really productive, really consistent. Last 2 games, he threw for 289 and 379, and he also has 2 touchdowns in each of those last 2 games. He's pretty much a lock for multiple passing touchdowns every game. So I would upgrade Cade Otton and Sterling Shepard. Baker is an MVP, and I think he will continue to put up top 10 numbers in fantasy. I'm not going to bench Baker Mayfield if I drafted him. At number 8, I'm also going to continue starting Dak Prescott, also playing at an MVP caliber rate. I did fade him a little bit last week because of the 3 offensive linemen that were injured, but Dak proved me wrong. I was wrong to downgrade him. So he's playing like that MVP. Even without CeeDee Lamb, he's been really on fire. And in his last 2 games, he does have 8 total touchdowns. One of them came on the ground, but 7 in the passing game. So he's unbenchable right now. The Panthers do rank as a rough matchup, though. They are bottom 7 against the position, allowing an average of 14.6 points per game. So if they remain vulnerable on the ground, if Javonte vultures multiple rushing touchdowns, it could look like week 1 where we get a low floor from Dak. But in general, the ceiling is so valuable, so high. He could drop 30 and it wouldn't shock you. So I'm still going to trust him. Where I'm encouraged is the Panthers are terrible at stopping tight ends. They give up almost 15 points per game to tight ends. And that means Jake Ferguson is going to dominate. I expect Dak to exploit that weakness in the defense. He has earned your trust. I would keep starting him. I got to rank him in the top 10. At number 9, I think we're dropping down a tier, but in a 12-team league, I think all these guys are worth a start. In a 10-team league, I would still definitely put Jordan Love in the lineup. At QB9, I am telling you to start Jordan Love versus the Bengals. And Cincinnati is going to get torched as always. They are atrociously bad at stopping both tight ends and running backs. So I do think Kraft is going to have a dominant performance this week. But I am a little worried that Josh Jacobs does also crush with multiple touchdowns. But off the bye, I think Matthew Golden, the rookie first-round wide receiver, is going to have a breakout game. So as long as that happens, I think you will get multiple touchdowns. I trust that Kraft pads the numbers, and Romeo Doubs probably carries his own weight as well. I think Jordan Love is a significant upgrade, definitely a safe option against the Bengals. Anytime you face off against Cincinnati, every opposing offensive weapon has a legitimate case to be started in your lineup. I would trust the quarterback. Give me Jordan Love as a top 10 play this week versus the Bengals. Number 10, we have Drake Maye at New Orleans, and Drake did not contribute very much last week. As I expected, I gave you a bad take on Drake Maye, but didn't expect the Bills defense to be that locked down in the first half. And then the offense got going in the second half. Maye almost threw for 300 yards, but both touchdowns were vultured by Ramondre Stevenson. So that was unfortunate. I predicted a rushing touchdown that did not hit, and apologies if you followed me on that underdog lineup. With the 4 quarterbacks scoring a rushing touchdown, none of them did cash. So apologies on that, but Drake Maye has been a top 10 quarterback this season in fantasy. He ranks as number 9 in fantasy points, averaging over 19 points per game. And I think based on that production, if he's your guy, if he's your starter, I'd keep rolling him out there. The Saints don't scare you that much. On paper, it is an upgrade. They do rank as a top 7 matchup. They've also allowed the 7th most rushing yards per game to the position, 29 on average to opposing quarterbacks. So I think Maye will contribute. Diggs has really stepped up, and the Saints are also pretty vulnerable against tight ends. I think Hunter Henry will find the end zone. I like Drake Maye to bounce back, and inevitably we'll get that breakout from Travion Henderson, but until then, New England can't really run the ball. Drake Maye is the straw that stirs the drink. Their offense has been good thanks to Drake Maye. He looked really good on Sunday night. I think he'll look even better against the Saints in New Orleans. Start Drake Maye, a top 10 play in week 6. At number 11, I think Daniel Jones is also deserving of a start. He's earned your trust. The Colts scored 4 rushing touchdowns last week, and 3 of them went to Taylor. 1 went to Amir Abdullah, and I don't expect that to repeat. In general, Daniel Jones plays for a very good offense. The Colts have looked like a juggernaut on the offensive side this season, and I would bet on their offense to keep him viable in fantasy. He's been a top 10 quarterback, averaging 19 points per game this season. I would continue to start him. He's capable of giving you 50 rushing yards and multiple rushing touchdowns. That keeps the floor very high and also opens the door for an elite ceiling if it clicks. So I'm going to keep him in the starting conversation. I think top 12 this week is a fair ranking. At number 11, I would start Daniel Jones versus the Cardinals. But at number 12, I'm tempted to bench Justin Herbert. If not for the matchup, I would not be ranking him this high. I'll be honest, I am wavering on my faith in the Chargers offense for a little bit. With their offensive line injuries and Hampton going down, I can't tell you it's a lock that the Chargers score 30 points this week. Against the Dolphins, they should, but it's just really not a safe bet. The pressure is one of the highest rates in the NFL. Herbert has barely 2 seconds to get the ball off. At least he did last week. It was brutal with their offensive line injuries. But they did bench center Bradley Bozeman, and that should help. He was atrocious at covering the blitz last week. So I'm hopeful for Herbert, but I'm not convinced he's going to be fantastic. He needs to get it done in the passing game, and he might not have enough time in the pocket. So he's going to rely on rushing stats. The Dolphins are giving up over 8 rushing points per game to opposing quarterbacks this season, and 4 rushing touchdowns on the year up to this point. So last week, Herbert really contributed on the ground. If that does not happen, though, I think you may not have any level floor here. Herbert, I think, is actually a major liability in your lineup right now. The offense is just not right. And until they get fully healthy, I'm not going to rank him back in the top 10. So even in an elite spot, the highest I can go is 12. And even this kind of makes me feel unsafe. I have Maye and Herbert in both my leagues, and I think I'm going to be benching Herbert in both of them. I expect to go with Drake Maye, but last week that was not the right call. Maye had a lower floor than Herbert. He had 60 rushing yards last week, and without it, he would have been terrible. So I'm hoping for the best, but can't feel super confident. The matchup, though, suggests you should start Justin Herbert against the Dolphins. Top 12 is a starting quarterback one most of the time. At number 13, I have Bo Nix at the bottom of this tier. Last player I think should be started in a typical 12-team league. But at 13, I guess you don't have to. If you have another option I rank higher, you could bench Bo Nix. But the Jets should be a great spot for Nix to crush. In general, they've had a terrible defense this season, despite a defensive head coach and good personnel. The game is in London, and that's the only variable where it could be a strange game and it may not go as expected. But if everything does line up as we think, the Broncos are going to blow out the Jets, and I don't see a reason to worry about this matchup. So even though he's had some high variance this season, I think this is one of those games where he should have a good stat line. I think it'll resemble the Bengals game where the Broncos offense gets to do whatever they want against their opponent. So I think against the Jets, he's a safe play, but he's been so up and down, I cannot consider him a must start. There has been some risk with Bo Nix this year. At 14, though, in the same game, I think I would rather bench Justin Fields. I am very worried about the Broncos matchup. Fields has earned your confidence. He has been a top 6 fantasy quarterback this season, but you definitely worry about the Broncos every time you face them, and you know that Pat Surtain is probably going to lock up Garrett Wilson. So he does rank top 6, but he also has benefit from 2 of the best matchups you can ask for each of the last 2 games, and now he's going up against a bottom 4 matchup, and to pretend like he has the same upside would be naive. But he can always drop a rushing touchdown from anywhere. If he gives you 50 rushing yards and a touchdown, you will be fine, but I could also see multiple turnovers here and no touchdowns. If you told me he throws for less than 150 yards, I wouldn't be surprised. He could offer a terrible, terrible bust performance. So I don't think he's a lock in the lineup. I want to rank him lower, but his production this season keeps him in the top 15. And only in a Superflex format would I feel like, yeah, he's a no-brainer, got to start him. But in a 1 quarterback league, I would probably bench him. Maybe you don't have a better option, but if you have Stafford or Jordan Love or Daniel Jones this week, I would go with them ahead of Justin Fields. I just don't want to chase the Broncos matchup. Their defense looks elite. At number 15, I think Mac Jones has earned streaming consideration every week. I pretty much consider him just as valuable as Brock Purdy, with the exception of the rushing stats. Mac Jones does not scramble the way that Purdy does. So that just makes him Jimmy Garoppolo in terms of fantasy production. That's how I view Mac Jones. And I remember ranking Garoppolo when he was the starter every week in the top 15 as well. The Shanahan quarterback always has a high floor. And against Baker, it could turn into a shootout. Even though the receiving core is depleted and injured, I still saw enough from Mac Jones last week where he earned my respect. I would expect close to 300 yards. Especially with McCaffrey catching so many passes, you get a lot of extra yak, and that really pads the stats. So if Tonjes and Kendrick Bourne contribute like they did last week against the Rams, Mac Jones will be a very good play. I think at 15 in a 2 quarterback league, he's worth a start. But in a 1 quarterback league, you can keep him on the wire. At some point, Purdy will return, and Mac Jones will get back on the bench. So you don't have to pick him up. You don't have to start him. But in a 2 quarterback Superflex league, I do think he's top 20. I rank him at 15 against Tampa Bay. At 16, I have Jared Goff at Kansas City, and I'm really worried that Goff just doesn't have consistency in fantasy. There's always the risk that he doesn't score the touchdowns that Gibbs and Montgomery vulture you. Even Montgomery vultured him for a passing touchdown last week, and that's really annoying. So Goff doesn't have anything in terms of rushing production. He's hyper touchdown reliant. And if you look at the game versus the Chiefs A couple years ago, back in 2023, week 1, Goff threw for 253 yards, only 1 touchdown, no picks, and had 14 fantasy points. That is a pretty consistent stat line for him this season. Roughly 14 points is his floor, but without multiple touchdowns, you will never go over 16. So Jared Goff is a bit boom bust. You're not going to get totally annihilated if you start him. He's not going to totally let you down with like 8 or fewer points, but you just can't tell me that you know for a fact Goff is dropping 3 touchdowns and 25 in fantasy. It's just not the safest bet. Typically outdoors in road games, Goff is nowhere near as good of a fantasy play as he is at home in indoor games. So I just don't see the ceiling. I don't think Goff is a lock in the lineup every week. I think he's worth benching in a 1 quarterback league. I don't love the matchup too much. It's pretty neutral right now. I do think the Chiefs step up. They can't really afford to fall to 2-4. So I think it could be a shootout, but it's not guaranteed. And I don't feel like Goff is the safest play. Without 3 touchdowns, there's pretty much no chance he goes over 20 fantasy points. It's very unlikely to happen. And I wouldn't be shocked if this week he does have multiple turnovers against the Chiefs. I expect at least 1 interception or fumble from Goff in this game. So kind of capped upside, worth a play in a 2 quarterback league, but in general, you're probably not starting Jared Goff with confidence. At 17, I think Darnold is a safe floor play, but last week I don't know if it's going to repeat. The Bucs turned that game into a shootout, and he did throw for 341 and 4 touchdowns, so it's nice to know he can do that, but in general, it's just not really how the Seahawks offense does operate. They prefer to win with defense most of the time. So against the Jags, they travel to Florida. It could be a weird environment. The Jags defense has played well, and there's always a chance that he does throw some interceptions. However, in the last 4 games, Darnold has been pretty good. With the exception of week 1, he's looked very, very safe in fantasy. You're definitely locking up at least like 16 points most of the time with Darnold. So tempted to rank him higher. He has 9 touchdowns, 3 picks in the last 4 weeks. He's been pretty effective, but he rarely scrambles that much, and rushing stats are hard to come by. Darnold is fine as a backup on your lineup, but I don't think he's a must start on the road at Jacksonville. At 18, I think Kyler Murray is on the cusp of being dropped in most leagues. If you haven't already done it, he is just so mediocre consistently. Last week, it was the same situation. He's hovering at 15, 16, 14 points every week. And even though he had a rushing touchdown, he also had a fumble, and then he also did not pass a single touchdown. So I just don't really trust him. I think at this point, it's pretty clear he's almost never giving you 20 points in fantasy. And he didn't practice earlier in the week with a foot injury, but he is back at practice today. So I think he will play. I think they will step up after an embarrassing loss. I think they start off pretty hot in the first half, but I always expect the Cardinals offense to disappoint, and it will stall out as the game goes on. I do think they lose this game to the Colts. So in a 1 quarterback league, I would not start Kyler. I would consider dropping him. He's been such a low upside option. It's hard to feel good starting him. He's only like a lock for 15, but this season he has never gone over 18 points. At 19, you want to upgrade Bryce Young in the best matchup on paper, but last week I upgraded him, ranked him at 13, I believe, and that was a top 2 matchup against Miami, and he was ass. He was dog shit, only 12 fantasy points. He only has 1 game with over 12 fantasy points on the year. So maybe you believe in this matchup so much you're willing to test your luck, but I'm not recommending you do that. I don't trust Bryce Young enough. I don't see enough upside from him to contribute. So in a Rico Dowdle revenge game, I expect a lot of ground and pound usage for him. That is going to keep Bryce Young from throwing a lot of yards. I will skip out on Bryce, even though I expect a breakout for Tet McMillan. I don't think Bryce Young is a safe play. The matchup makes me rank him top 20, but his production this season, I think 19 is the highest I can go. I would keep Bryce Young on the bench or the wire. I don't think he's worth picking up. As the matchups get worse, you're not going to feel as confident starting him rest of season. Lastly, in this tier, I have Trevor Lawrence versus Seattle, who was amazing on the ground last week with 2 rushing touchdowns. That really inflated the numbers, though, and it's not really something to expect to repeat. So in Superflex, I'd be fine starting Lawrence. He's had a decent floor this year, but not that good production. Other than last week, it has been kind of bad, on the similar footing to like Tua in terms of fantasy points. And the Seahawks do have a good defense, but they're pretty banged up in the secondary. They're also traveling to Florida. I think last week we saw some encouragement from Brian Thomas Jr. and Travis Hunter. Lawrence is moving up the ranks, but against Seattle, I'm not going to feel like I have to start him. If I don't have to, I'll bench him. Even in a super flex league, I don't think you have to start Lawrence. He probably only gives you like 14, 15, 16 points, most likely. Beyond the top 20, I would bench all these players, but I was wrong to tell you Jaxson Dart was not a top 20 play. Definitely a really good game, and I knew he could run for 50 plus yards, but the 3 turnovers versus the Saints was a major red flag. He was missing Slayton, and we know Neighbors is out, so I didn't trust his wide receivers. Quinyon Mitchell and Jalen Carter were both hurt in this game, and that definitely led me to overestimate the Eagles defense. So Dart is going to be a top 15 quarterback moving forward. His rushing stats are just too valuable. I did rank him too low going in to Thursday night. At 22, I have Michael Penix Jr. versus Buffalo, and I think the Bills game will be more competitive than most people think, but Penix has been way too unpredictable this season. He's shown some elite upside, but also a complete lack of floor. There's been too much variance to trust, and I do think they're going to try and dominate time of possession by running the ball with Bijan and Algier. So maybe London torches the Bills, but I don't think Penix throws for multiple touchdowns this week. I don't think he's a safe play against the Bills. At 23, I think the Chargers defense needs to show up. It's a must-win for them after losing 2 straight, and I do worry about Tua not giving you any rushing value. That is where you can exploit the Chargers defense. Tua does not scramble, is not mobile at all, so he's going to rely on multiple touchdowns, and other than one going to Waller, I don't feel confident he has more touchdowns than interceptions. So not going to trust Tua. I'm also still worried that he leaves the game early with a concussion. It's hard to watch the game and be rooting for him. You always feel a little on edge whenever he gets hit by anyone. So not going to start him. Feels too risky. The Chargers defense is a downgrade. Spencer Rattler has been okay. He's not exciting to start, but he has had some level value this season, and he's not as bad as I made him sound like he was back at the beginning of the year. But against the Pats, it's not an upgrade, it's not a downgrade, it's just a neutral ranking here. At 24, I'm not going to start Spencer Rattler. At 25, I'm also not going to start Flacco, but undeniable upside going to the Bengals offense with those wide receivers. It's always possible, but the Packers got beat by him earlier in the year. They're off a bye. It's a revenge game. I think the Packers want revenge. I think Flacco will look like shit. He could definitely lay an egg. I have no faith in starting Joe Flacco. Aaron Rodgers off the bye is tempting, but the Browns have a very legit defense. I rank him below the tier break, and I think these last 5 quarterbacks are terrible starts this week. The Steelers offense just doesn't offer enough upside. Rodgers will get the win, but not going to force it down the field. He doesn't have to do much in order to beat Cleveland. So not going to start him. I don't see much upside, no rushing value. And then the Raiders-Titans game on paper does offer a lot of upside. Neither defense does scare you. So I want to rank Cam Ward significantly higher, but he's been so bad I cannot trust him. And then same with Geno. I could see some high upside here, but he has 9 interceptions on the season. He could give you less than 3 fantasy points and you wouldn't be shocked. I will keep Ward and Geno on the bench. I also am saying fuck no to Dylan Gabriel, the rookie making his second start against Mike Tomlin's defense off a bye. Fuck no. And then Cooper Rush was so inept last week against Houston. The Rams aren't as bad of a matchup, but he literally had 1 point. He almost had negative fantasy points. You are asking to lose if you start Cooper Rush. So those are my quarterback rankings this week. Now let's talk about the tight end position. And these are the best and worst matchups. In blue, we have how many points per game they're allowing on average every week. And then in red, we have how many yards per game they're giving up to the position. So there are some trends we can pick up on. If opposing defenses allow more than 55 receiving yards, 60 or more especially, they are so much more likely to be on the left side of this chart, and they are so much more likely to give you an upgrade in terms of matchups. The gap between blue and red represents mostly touchdown production. So if it's a wide gap, the odds of touchdowns for those tight ends are even higher. The best matchup this week would be Pittsburgh, who give up almost 16 points per game and 65 yards per game to the position. But David Njoku and Harold Fannin are kind of splitting the reps. I want to upgrade both of them as must starts, but they kind of eat into each other's production. I can't guarantee which player scores a touchdown, but last week Gabriel liked both guys. He had a touchdown for both of them, and I do think Njoku's the safer play, but Fannin has legit streaming value as well. The Steelers matchup, very vulnerable to opposing tight ends. Next up on the list would be Cincinnati. So Tucker Kraft is going to dominate this week. The Bengals have also given up 4 touchdowns to the position this year. Kraft will be elite against the Bengals this week. But number 3 on the list does give up the most yardage per game to the position. The Carolina Panthers allow 80 tight end receiving yards on average per week. So Jake Ferguson was already a lock in the lineup, and he is clearly the best play this week. I definitely want Ferguson in my lineup, an automatic start against Carolina. Number 4 on the list is a bit of a drop down in terms of tiers, but giving up 13.4 points would be Seattle, who get Jacksonville this week. Brenton Strange went on IR, so I don't know if you're trusting Johnny Munt. Kind of a matchup that's wasted. In Green Bay, that's also a very big upgrade, so Noah Fant and Mike Gesicki probably not worth starting, but on paper get an upgrade. And then the Saints have also been pretty vulnerable. They also have allowed 4 tight end touchdowns this season. So Hunter Henry does get a big upgrade. Maybe Austin Hooper vultures him, but I would feel confident starting Hunter Henry against the Saints. In the same matchup, the Patriots are also pretty vulnerable. So Juwan Johnson should get an upgrade. And the Patriots give up the second most yards to the position, 75 on average. As long as Juwan Johnson is healthy enough, he has been dealing with an injury. It's been pretty bad the last 2 weeks. I would trust him. I think the floor should be much higher for Juwan Johnson against New England. But another upgrade would be Miami, but the Chargers are kind of mixing it up at tight end. So maybe you trust Tyler Conklin this week, but I do not. I'm not going to start him. In Tampa Bay, that's also been a good matchup, especially for touchdowns. They have only given up 44 yards per game to the position, but also 4 tight end touchdowns on the year. So Kittle is expected to be out once again. Jake Tonjes might continue scoring touchdowns. He has 3 on the season, and he did have 11 targets last week. Tonjes does have streaming value this week. The Vikings have been an upgrade, but they're on bye, so that's not a factor. And then last major upgrade would be Baltimore, giving up 11.5 points per game is the threshold where I still think it's an upgrade. But against the Rams, their tight end core is banged up. Higbee and Colby Parkinson are probably not going to suit up. Davis Allen and Terrence Ferguson do not feel like safe plays. So that is a non-factor. And then the last 3 matchups I want to bring up have given up a lot of touchdowns to the position. The Jets have given up 4 touchdowns this season. So Evan Engram might get back in the end zone for the second week in a row. He has been somewhat decent the last 2 games. And then Detroit have allowed 3 touchdowns this year to tight ends. So Kelce probably scores a touchdown. And then lastly, San Francisco, also a decent matchup for Cade Otton. They have also allowed 3 touchdowns to tight ends on the year. With Godwin doubtful, maybe Otton has to step up for the second week in a row. So those are the big upgrades. There's a lot of neutral matchups I'm not going to bring up, but on the opposite side of this chart, Atlanta is the most difficult matchup on paper. Only 2.7 points per game allowed to the position this season. But there is a smaller sample size for the Falcons. They were on bye last week, so maybe against Dalton Kincaid, they will give up a lot more production, but not a single touchdown on the year and only 17 yards per game on average. So I'm not excited to trust Kincaid this week. I think the Bills offense could struggle. The Falcons defense is underrated, and if Kincaid is held out of the end zone, he will not be a safe start at all this week. So not excited to start Kincaid, but he's been so good, you're probably going to keep starting him. And then the Bills in the same game have also been terrible for opposing tight ends. So Kyle Pitts also gets a big downgrade, not going to trust him too much. The Chiefs have also been pretty difficult. So Sam LaPorta, not a safe bet. They have not given up a single touchdown this year, but LaPorta had a big breakout last week. You probably feel like you want to start LaPorta. The Eagles were a rough spot for Theo Johnson. I was fooled by Theo Johnson's touchdown production. They gave up a touchdown to Evan Engram, and I thought he'd be okay, but I was wrong on Theo Johnson. The Texans have been a bad matchup, but they're on bye, so that's irrelevant. The Chargers have also been a tough matchup, but also allowed 2 touchdowns to the position this season. So Waller probably still finds the end zone, but on paper may not give you many yards. And then the Raiders have also been good at stopping tight ends, so Okonkwo, kind of hard to trust. And then the Giants were a downgrade on paper for Goedert, but Goedert had over 100 yards. Maybe that's a sign that some of these stats are not worth buying into. You can still have a great game against a bad matchup. You can still lay an egg against a good matchup. So Goedert is a sign of maybe not trusting these stats at all. And then the last 2 matchups I think are downgrades would be Denver against Mason Taylor, but his volume as of late has been so good, I'd still probably rely on him. And then the Browns have also been good at stopping tight ends. Jonnu Smith and Freiermuth splitting snaps, not the safest starts with the Steelers tight end. So that's it for the matchups at tight end. Now I'll show you my rankings at the position. And I think number 1 and 2 are locks in the lineup. Ferguson has been so dominant with CeeDee Lamb off the field. He is a lock in the lineup. And the Panthers give up the most yards per game to the position, 80 yards on average. Ferguson is going to crush. He is clearly the best play, but I could see Kraft give him a good run for his money. I think Kraft is an elite option as well. The Bengals are the second best matchup for opposing tight ends, and they have allowed 4 touchdowns on the season, and the third most yards per game allowed to the position as well, with 70 on average every week. So Kraft is a must start, but I think Ferguson in that Cowboys offense is slightly better. I think both of these two will be the best plays this week. They're in the elite tier, 1 and 2, Ferguson and Kraft. At number 3, I have Tyler Warren versus Arizona. And in the same game, I have Trey McBride at the Colts at number 4. So let's stick with Warren. He's basically been giving you exactly what McBride has offered, but he also has 2 touchdowns on the season, and he is looking like the higher upside option. So if you drafted him, he has really paid off. He looks phenomenal, looks like a must start every week. At number 4, McBride is the only high-priced tight end that has actually paid off and lived up to the billing. But even if you drafted him, you kind of feel underwhelmed with his production. It feels like you probably should have waited for a later round tight end option. But he does have a bust-proof floor that is saying a lot. I'm not going to complain if he gives me another 7-catch, 80-yard game. Even without a touchdown, that is all you can ask for from an elite tight end. So I wish he could find the end zone, but in general, that doesn't happen. He's an automatic start, but I don't think he's top 2 anymore. I think there is higher upside with some other guys. I love the matchups a lot more for Ferguson and Kraft. And even in the same game, I think Warren has a higher likelihood of finding the end zone. So Trey McBride, a must start, but only tight end 4 in the rankings now. Once Kittle and Bowers return, McBride might not be ranked in the top 5. At number 5, though, I think we're dropping down a tier, but these next 4 players are pretty safe so far. I think I would keep starting them. We have Darren Waller at number 5 versus the Chargers. And Waller has 16 points in each of his last 2 games and 3 touchdowns in that span. So he is picking up right where Jonnu Smith left off, and now that he's healthy and Tyreek Hill is injured, I think it's legit. He might not give you this level ceiling every week, but based on the first 2 games, if you picked up Waller off the wire, he looks like a must start. So I would start him, even though the Chargers did hold Zach Ertz to a bagel last week. I think Waller will be fine. I think he'll find pay dirt yet again. Number 6, I think Kelce is going to find the end zone this week. The Lions have allowed 3 touchdowns to the position this season, and Kelce has actually been pretty decent in fantasy this season. He does rank as a top 10 tight end. He offers 9 points per game on average. So if you remove George Kittle and Waller from the points per game ranking, he actually bumps up to number 7 on the season in terms of total points. And I do think Kelce has earned your trust. He's not the same player from 3 seasons ago, but he has not fallen off a cliff. He's still relevant in fantasy, still a decent bet for a touchdown. And Xavier Worthy did not practice on Thursday. That's worth monitoring. It would increase the touchdown odds if Worthy is inactive. At 7 in the same matchup, I did bring up a rough matchup for Sam LaPorta. The Chiefs rank bottom 3, but I could see their defense stop Amon-Ra. They are notoriously good at limiting opposing number 1 wide receivers. So if they can hold Amon-Ra back a little bit, that means that production has to go elsewhere. And I do think LaPorta will step up. He had a breakout game last week and reminded you of his ceiling. He had 18 fantasy points over 20 in full PPR. So I still want to bet on his high-end outcomes. And against the Chiefs, it could turn into a shootout. I think he'll be okay, but on paper, the matchup stats suggest you should be fading LaPorta. The touchdowns have not been there at all this season for the tight ends against Kansas City. But before he got injured last week, Brenton Strange was starting to pop off. He had a big play down the field, and I think LaPorta will be all right. So maybe you're more concerned about the matchup stats than I am, but I still think I would start LaPorta. I think he's worth a top 10 rank given his high-end upside potential. At number 8, I think David Njoku is a safe start this week. The Steelers are the best tight end matchup on paper, giving up just shy of 16 points per game. And last week, Njoku was the top target for Dylan Gabriel. So I'm going to trust the matchup stats. I'm going to trust the chemistry with the quarterback. And although Harold Fannin is factoring in, I think there's enough to go around for both tight ends to be productive. So I saw enough from Njoku last week to think he is stepping into that Cedric Tillman role in the passing game. Jerry Jeudy gets a tough matchup on Joey Porter Jr., and I do think with Tillman on IR, Njoku is the safest start in the passing game for the Browns. So I prefer him over Fannin. I think he's a top 10 play. The matchup suggests it's a major upgrade, and I want to be starting tight ends against the Steelers. So start Njoku at number 8. I think he is a lock in the lineup if you have him. At number 9, I was wrong on Theo Johnson. Boy, I whiffed on this ranking. He only gave you 2 catches for 27 yards. He had a deep pass down the field that he did not hang on to, so it could have been a better stat line, but it just did not pan out. I think I was fooled by the Evan Engram touchdown against the Eagles the week prior. I thought Theo Johnson would get his 4th touchdown of the season. He looked like the go-to target for Jaxson Dart, and last week it just did not work out. The Eagles did hold Theo Johnson to a rough game. So I apologize for that. The biggest apology I owe to whoever in the live chat comments was asking, should I start Goedert or Theo Johnson? I fucking whiffed on Dallas Goedert. I read too much into the 19 yards he had last week. I did not trust his touchdown production to continue or the target share to increase. I think with Grant Calcaterra missing last week, he also had an increased snap share that led to even more targets. So I was dead wrong on Goedert. He had over 100 yards. This was probably my worst call. I did tell you to start him, but I was way too low in the rankings, especially Theo Johnson over Goedert. That looks like a terrible, terrible call. I apologize if you trusted me on that decision. Really, really bad decision to put Goedert down at 10. He's been top 5 this season. He will be ranked top 5 next week. At number 11, I have Hunter Henry at New Orleans, and the Saints are a top 6 matchup. They have allowed 4 touchdowns on the season to the tight end position. So as long as Austin Hooper doesn't vulture him, it's unlikely that happens. I think Hunter Henry will have a good game. I think he will find the end zone. I would start him, but last week the volume kind of fell off a little bit, and there are some good matchups for other players. I think Henry is worth a start, but at number 11, I wish I had him above Theo Johnson. At number 12, I have Mason Taylor versus Denver, and the matchup on paper isn't the best for Taylor, but I still think his production the last 2 games makes him a very viable start in your lineup. He has 19 targets last 2 weeks, 14 catches, an average of 66 yards per game, and although I don't expect a touchdown, the Broncos have not given up more than 1 to tight ends this season. I still think he will step up. I expect him to see the most volume in this offense because Garrett Wilson will be limited by Pat Surtain. So I trust the volume here, but I don't trust a touchdown. I think the floor is very safe with Mason Taylor. But at 13, the floor has been pretty high for Kyle Pitts this season. Versus Buffalo, it is a bottom 2 matchup, and I am downgrading both Pitts and Kincaid in this matchup. It's tough for both of them against the defenses they've been locking up, opposing tight ends. But Pitts is averaging over 50 yards per game this season, and Darnell Mooney is not a safe bet to play, has not practiced so far as of this recording. So he could step up. I do think Penix will look to him often, and he has been good enough this season where you can feel somewhat confident in his floor. So a high-end streamer, just because the matchup is bad, doesn't mean I'm going to completely fade Kyle Pitts. But I am worried that he does offer that bagel that we're expecting. At some point, Pitts will let you down. At tight end 13, I think you could do better. I'd rather go Mason Taylor off the waiver wire. And then at number 14 in the same matchup, I have Kincaid, and I am worried about this matchup. The Falcons only give up 2.7 points per game to opposing tight ends this season. So in fantasy, this is the worst matchup you can ask for, but Kincaid has been hyper productive. He looks like a must start, and I can't fade him too much. But at number 14, I'm going to buy into the matchup stats a little bit. Only 17 yards per game on average to the position. And they faced Cade Otton, TJ Hawkinson, Jatavion Sanders, and Zach Ertz. All of those teams maybe don't use the tight end like crazy, but they are somewhat incorporated. I don't know if it's fully just because of the teams they've faced. I still think on paper it should be a downgrade for Kincaid. But he's been super productive. He had 100 plus yards last week, but the week prior, only 2 targets, 1 catch. He also has 3 touchdowns, though, and his floor has been very safe this season. So I'm reluctant to drop him too far, but against the Falcons, I am worried. I also want to acknowledge he's questionable, and although he's limited in practice, I think he'll play, but he is technically not a lock if he's questionable on the injury report. So monitor his status. We'll have a better idea tomorrow after Saturday's practice. I think he'll be fine, but at number 14, I think he's at the bottom of this tier in the low end start category at the position. But 15 through 20, I think are all legit streamers this week. Odds are you don't have the space to start him, but I do think you could pick them up and plug him in if you needed someone off the wire. At 15, I have Cade Otton versus San Francisco, and last week he finally stepped up. It was a great matchup for him. I had a good ranking. I ranked him top 13, and he did have 81 yards. He was pretty good, but did not score a touchdown. That was the only thing missing, and this week it does probably come back to him, at least in terms of production. I think he should be fine because Chris Godwin is doubtful and Evans is still out. All of the production can't just go to Igbuka. So I think Otton will be all right. I think he's going to have a decent floor. I think he's worth a streaming option if you can't get your hands on Njoku or Mason Taylor, or if you missed out on Waller off the wire. I think Otton is a decent pickup if you're looking for someone off the waiver wire. At 16, I have Harold Fannin at the Steelers, and the Steelers are the best matchup on paper, but I do think it benefits Njoku a little bit more. But Fannin still scored a touchdown on 4 targets last week with Dylan Gabriel, so he does have some value, but I think I prefer Njoku right now. And if you wanted to drop him and leave him on the wire, I wouldn't fault you, but the Steelers matchup suggests there is value here. They do give up 1 touchdown per game to the position. So maybe it goes to Fannin. Maybe both tight ends have good games here. I don't think he'll be elite. I'd rather go Njoku, but I still think he's interesting enough to be worth a start consideration at the very least. At 17, I think Evan Engram is also in that similar bucket. Last 2 games since coming back from injury, he does have 13 targets. And last week, he found the end zone. So this Jets matchup suggests he could do that again. The Jets have allowed 4 tight end touchdowns on the season in 5 games. But Engram isn't like super productive from a yards per reception standpoint. He could still give you like 5 catches and less than 30 yards. So I don't think he's a top 10 guy, but he is a decent streamer if you need someone off the wire. He's still somewhat available overall at the position. So could do worse, could do better. At 17, I'm probably going to bench him, most likely. At 18, however, if you're still trying to replace George Kittle, Jake Tonjes can't be dismissed. He has 3 touchdowns on the season. Last week, he had 11 targets, and it looks like Pearsall and Jennings are unlikely to play for the second week in a row. So he does have chemistry with Mac Jones. He does get involved, and the Bucs matchup have given up 4 touchdowns as well to the position this season. So a 4th touchdown for Tonjes is not the worst bet you could make. However, I understand leaving him on the waiver wire because next week in week 7, it is expected that Kittle will return. So not dying to pick him up, but if you are desperate, you could do far worse. I do think a touchdown is a decent bet for Jake Tonjes. At 19, Juwan Johnson gets a good matchup on paper, but he has been banged up and pretty mediocre the last 2 games. The Patriots give up 75 receiving yards per game to the position. So if the volume can come back to him, then Juwan Johnson should be productive. But last 2 weeks, it's been brutal. I think you've probably lost some confidence. I doubt you're going to start him, especially with Taysom Hill coming back to the offense. There is some diminished return on Juwan. I don't know if I would trust him. I think he's probably more likely a drop candidate than a must start. At 20, I want to acknowledge it, but I can't say I believe in it. AJ Barner of the Seahawks has been hyper productive. He does have 4 touchdowns on the season. He ranks as tight end 12 in scoring, averaging 9 points per game in half PPR. But only last week did he have his first game with more than 3 targets. I still think they want to get Elijah Arroyo established, and I don't fully believe that Barner will keep this up. But I want to consider him in the ranks, though. Any player with 4 touchdowns in 4 games is on my radar, but to pretend like it feels like a safe bet, that would be a lie. No thanks on Barner, but if he puts up another touchdown, I would not be shocked. Darnold does seem to like him. Outside the top 20, I don't think there's a chance you're starting them, but there is a chance they do prove me wrong here with these rankings. At 21, I have Zach Ertz. Damn, I was wrong on him last week. I ranked him top 3. He put up a bagel. That was probably my worst call of the season. I know Debo did play, but with Terry out and Daniels coming back, I thought he would step up. He does have 9 touchdowns dating back to last year. I thought he'd be good, but damn, that was awful from Zach Ertz. Chigo Okonkwo gets a tough matchup, but the Raiders' defense on paper isn't that scary. Technically, it is a downgrade, but it looks like Okonkwo is the number 2 target for Cam Ward. I think the floor is going to be about 35, 40 yards most weeks, and if you just need 6 points, that's fine from Okonkwo. But Jatavion Sanders expected to return to the field this week. He's back at practice after missing 2 games with a high ankle sprain. And Tremble was really good in his absence 2 weeks ago, but then last week got hurt and had no value. I do think Sanders has some roster consideration, but until we see it consistently, I can't pick him up. A name to watch, but not to start. At 24, it looks like Brock Bowers will miss again, so Michael Mayer off the concussion probably gets the start and probably has some value, but not enough to pick up. He probably gets back on the bench the week after when Bowers returns. I don't think it's worth it to pick him up, but he might have a good game. It is possible that Mayer plays well. At 25, the Steelers are kind of random, so I don't think I trust Jonnu Smith in the lineup, but he does have some touchdown production, very dependent on that, so not going to bet on it. And then Colt Kmet, I think, is more valuable among the Bears tight ends, but off the bye, it is possible that the rookie Loveland does get more incorporated into the offense, so I'll stay away. And then as long as Lamar Jackson is out, I'm not going to trust Andrews with Cooper Rush. He has a bye next week, so honestly, you could drop Andrews if you haven't done so already. Those are my tight end rankings this week. Now let's wrap up this video with the defensive ranks. At number 1, I have the Packers versus Cincinnati. Flacco is not the answer, so off the bye, the Green Bay defense wants revenge from that Browns loss. I think they're a must start at home versus the Bengals. At number 2, I have the Steelers versus Cleveland, and Tomlin's defense off a bye against a rookie making his 2nd career start. Sign me up. I think the Tomlin defense will force at least 2 turnovers. And then the Rams at number 3 get Cooper Rush, who looked so inept last week. 10 points against Houston. I think you have to trust the Rams defense. They will respond after an embarrassing loss to Mac Jones and a bunch of backups. So those 3 are in the elite tier. I think if you have those 3 defenses, they are must starts this week. And my favorite would be the Green Bay Packers. But at number 4 through 7, I think we're in tier 2, and these guys are all pretty safe starts in my opinion. At number 4, I have the Broncos versus the Jets, and London is the only variable about this game that makes it a bit of a toss-up, but odds are it'll go as expected, and odds are the Broncos have shutout potential. I think they will blow out Justin Fields. Number 5, the Chargers at Miami. The Dolphins are always mistake prone, so I'm a bit worried about the travel, but this is a must win. The Chargers defense should show up They have to. At 6, I have the Patriots at New Orleans. The Saints are always a plus matchup. Definitely want to be chasing any defense against Spencer Rattler. And they are getting better, especially with Christian Gonzalez back. I think they are a top 10 play. Their schedule is really good moving forward. There'll be a consistent top 10 play for a while. At number 7, I was wrong about the Eagles. I underestimated Jaxson Dart and Cam Skattebo. A rough game for Philly, but if you saw this coming, if you thought the Giants offense would drop 34 points, I think you are lying. I don't believe it. At number 8, I think we're dropping down a tier, and risk does start to factor in, but the Jags-Seahawks game I think is going to be a weird one, and I think it's more likely a defensive game than a shootout. So in Florida, I could see the Seahawks be a bit tired off the travel. They are very injured in the secondary, and they did just get torched by the Bucs. So there's a chance they burn you, but I don't think the Jags offense is that good. I think both defenses have been good enough this year where I think they're a good start in the top 10, and I picked the Jags to win. So that's my tiebreaker. That's why I would go Jaguars over Seahawks, but I don't feel like that's a lock to pan out. I think they're both safe starts from a floor standpoint. I think they're fine. At 10, I have the Colts versus Arizona, and the Cardinals are either going to come out on fire after the embarrassing loss to the Tennessee Titans, or they're going to look like total dog shit, and their offense in general is not that scary. So with Kyler dealing with an injury, I think the Colts are a safe play. I think you should start Indianapolis. At number 11, I have the Browns at Pittsburgh, and Rodgers' offense is not a juggernaut this season, so Browns have showed up. I think they could keep this game low scoring. I think they're a safe floor play as they have been all year. At 12 through 15, I think these are the last defenses I would consider in my lineup most likely. The Titans-Raiders game, you would think, offers some value. Geno Smith has 9 interceptions this year, so could be 12 by the end of the game. The Titans do have upside, but they've been terrible this season, so I don't think I actually want to trust and start them. And then the Raiders against Cam Ward should also play well. They have a decent run defense, but have given up a lot of touchdowns. I don't feel good about either one in my lineup, so odds are I'll leave them on the wire. You're going to be dropping them, no doubt, after this game, so maybe just leave them alone. It feels too risky. It sounds like it could work out based on their opponents, but it does feel very risky. At 14, the Dolphins are also hyper risky, but the Chargers offensive line and Hampton going down is definitely a bit encouraging. I think this will be a close, low-scoring game, somewhere like 23-20, and you could do worse than the Dolphins, but against Justin Herbert, you could get torched. It's very hard to trust Miami, but there's actually a lot of rough spots for good defenses. It's actually pretty slim pickings the rest of the way. The last one I would consider would be the Saints versus the Patriots, and their defense has played all right this year, but especially at home, that's really the only reason I would consider them. Their floor is okay, but if you told me Drake Maye had a really good game, I could see them burning you. So no thanks with them. If I can avoid it, I would. But rest of the way, I think it's really, really hard to trust. The Panthers-Cowboys game, I see a lot more offense than defense. The Cowboys defense sucks, so no thanks there. Dak is playing at an MVP level. I'm not going to trust Carolina. And then the Giants, I did underestimate. The Eagles looked pretty bad. The Cardinals against the Colts, I'm not going to test Jonathan Taylor. No thanks there. The Bills at 20. This game, I think, is a high-scoring game, so I do prefer the Bills, but I have the Falcons right behind them. And the Falcons' defense is underrated. Off the bye, they could step up. I don't see a safe floor from either defense in your lineup. No thanks with the Bills and Falcons. The Jets, not going to go against Sean Payton if I don't have to, so no thanks there. The Chiefs and Lions game could be low scoring, but I think it's more likely a shootout, so going to pass on that. The Bucs-Niners game, going to have a lot of offense with Shanahan versus Baker. Not going to trust them. And then the Commanders-Bears game, I think, is also another shootout, so maybe Chicago looks like shit, but not going to go against Ben Johnson or Jayden Daniels. And then the Bengals at Green Bay, fuck no. And then the Ravens versus the Rams, fuck no as well. So that's it for my rankings this week at quarterback, tight end, and defense. These are the top 20 at all 3 positions. I'm 100% starting the top 8 quarterbacks. I think Josh Allen is always a lock, but a rough matchup for him. Mahomes has been lights out in fantasy this year. I think he will contribute on the ground. Daniels, I think, gets back to top 5. And then Hurts maybe doesn't finish top 5, but always have to start him. Stafford gets an elite matchup, should throw for 3 touchdowns this week. Caleb, I think, will offer shootout potential. A lot of rushing yards will pad the stats. Baker and Dak are MVP candidates, so cannot bench them. And then outside the top 8, I would still start Jordan Love, Drake Maye, Daniel Jones, Herbert, and Bo Nix. Love the matchup for Love. Maye should have some rushing stats this week. The Saints are a good matchup. Daniel Jones, always a decent floor, and Herbert is a bit risky, but gets a top 2 matchup, so I will start him. And then the Jets should let Bo Nix do whatever he wants, but he has been up and down. A bit hard to fully trust Bo Nix at the moment. But starting with Fields, I think they're just streaming options in 2 quarterback leagues. I'd start them, but in 1 quarterback leagues, I would bench him. Against Denver, I don't trust Fields to have the same upside. Mac Jones has a decent floor, but maybe not the same level upside as last week. Goff could burn you if he doesn't throw for multiple touchdowns. I think the Chiefs could be a problem, but the floor will be safe. And then with Darnold, I'd like to see it one more time before I lock him in to the lineup. Kyler has had no upside, so if all you want is 15 points, go ahead, but he is banged up, not my favorite play. Bryce Young gets a great matchup, but it feels wasted. He's been terrible this season. And then Trevor Lawrence, a tough matchup, but did flash some upside last week. It is possible you'll start Trevor Lawrence in a 2 quarterback league. At tight end, I think there's a lot of good options, but some of them get bad matchups. Ferguson and Kraft are going to dominate. Warren and McBride are 2 of the safest guys you can find. Waller, I think, finds another touchdown this week. So will Kelce, in my opinion. And I also think LaPorta and Njoku will find the end zone as well. I think you should be starting the top 8 tight ends. But on paper, LaPorta gets a very difficult matchup. It's possible I'm wrong on LaPorta. I was wrong on Theo Johnson. He is not going to finish top 10 this week. I was dead wrong there. Goedert will definitely finish much higher. He's probably the tight end 1 on the week, so I was too low on his rank. And then Hunter Henry gets a great matchup, but sometimes fades away a little bit. I think he's in the top 15, but not always a lock to be top 10. Mason Taylor has had a lot of volume the last 2 games. I think it continues as Pat Surtain locks up Garrett Wilson. And then Pitts and Kincaid have been productive this year, but rough matchups for them. They are definitely outside my top 10 this week. And then Otton, Fannin, Engram, Tonjes, Juwan Johnson, and AJ Barner, I actually think have very legit streaming value, but probably not enough to lock into the lineup. If you're not desperate off the wire, just stick with who you got. At defense, though, I'm locking in the Packers, Steelers, and Rams into my lineup. I was wrong about the Eagles, but in the same tier as the Broncos, Chargers, and Patriots. Entering the week, they feel like the matchups are too good to bench them. And then the Jags, Seahawks, Colts, and Browns, I think have good floors, but maybe capped upside. And then the last ones I would feel somewhat okay with would be the Titans, Raiders, Dolphins, and Saints. Their opposing matchups aren't the scariest you could find, but it feels really, really risky to trust him. Maybe you will look to some of the lower ranked options, but I feel pretty gross about the Panthers, Cowboys, Giants, Cardinals, Bills, and everyone outside the top 20. I think I'd fade most defenses beyond the Browns. That's going to be it for this video. If you enjoyed, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. I will see you tomorrow with all of the injury updates at every position. Subscribe and hit the like button. I'll see you next time. My name's Adam Riancho. Thank you for watching. Nice and blunt.